27 people were buried on a hillside in Maryland with no names, no headstones, and no paperwork anyone thought was worth keeping. 41,799 Americans alive right now carry their DNA. Both of those sentences are true at the same time. And I have not been able to stop thinking about the distance between them, because think about what that actually means for a second. Somewhere today, a woman is sitting in traffic in Baltimore. A man is closing up a shop in Frederick. Somebody is on a plane, and every one of them is carrying, inside every cell of their body, pieces of a person who was buried in a slat coffin on a hillside 200 years ago, in a grave with nothing written on it. They don't know. Almost none of them know. So let me take you to the hillside. It's in northern Maryland, at the foot of Catoctin Mountain, in a fold of the Blue Ridge where the ore in the ground runs rust red. Today you can stand at an overlook and see it. A slope of hardwood and leaf litter, ordinary in every way, the kind of ground you'd walk past without a second look. Behind you is a stone furnace stack. In front of you, close enough that you have to raise your voice over it, is a highway to Route 15. Cars going 70 miles an hour to Thurmont and Frederick. That noise matters, because this was never a peaceful place. The cemetery sits right next to the old ore pit, which means that when people came here to bury their dead, they buried them in the middle of an industrial site. There was no quiet, no privacy. The hammering never stopped. Whatever last words anybody said over these graves, they said them loudly, over the sound of the work that killed the person in the ground. And that's the first thing I want you to hold on to. Not the science, just that. In the summer of 1979, the state came to widen the highway. The bulldozers hit the slope, and archaeologists were called in fast, and what they found under the tree roots was 35 graves. Not a lost civilization, not a mystery. A cemetery, one that people in the village had half forgotten was there. Simple coffins nailed together from slats, pins that had held burial shrouds closed, buttons, over 1,000 small objects, and almost all of them were the hardware of a burial, which tells you something all by itself. Somebody dressed these people. Somebody made the boxes. Somebody cared enough to do it properly, in a place that gave them nothing to do it with. Today, that highway would be moved. In 1979, the decision went the other way. The graves came up, the road went through, and the remains were sent to the Smithsonian, where they have been ever since. And roughly half of those graves held children. Here's what the furnace was. It was a stone tower that had to stay lit. Once you start a furnace like that, you don't stop it for the night, or for Sunday, or for weather. It runs for months at a time, and it eats ore, charcoal, limestone, air, and people. Somebody has to climb the top and feed it. Somebody has to haul ore out of the pit. Somebody has to stand next to molten iron and pour it into sand molds while it's still bright enough to hurt your eyes. It took around 70 workers to keep it alive, and in the early years, a huge share of them were enslaved. They were not unskilled labor, and I want to be really clear about that, because the assumption runs the other way. These were blacksmiths, founders, colliers who knew exactly how to burn a stack of wood down to charcoal without letting it catch. Forge men who could read the color of hot metal the way you read a face, men who understood the furnace better than the men who owned it, and who taught those skills to the village's teenagers because that's how the knowledge moved. The iron they made went into stoves and kettles and plates in colonial kitchens. It also went into shells fired at Yorktown, the last real battle of the Revolutionary War, which means American independence was cast, in part, by people who did not get any. I sat with that one for a long time, and their bodies recorded the job. That's the part that gets me, because the bones from that hillside are not anonymous, they're specific. One man's spine had bent and fused solid, locked in place from carrying loads no body is designed to carry. A teenager's vertebrae were crushed flat, compressed by weight, in a person still young enough to be growing. A young woman had a hip deformity that would have given her a limp for her entire life, every step, every day, and no version of that life let her rest. And in the bone chemistry, there's zinc, the metal that came off the furnace as smoke, which means we can still measure the air they breathed. You don't need a genetics degree to feel that. You just need a back. But that was the surface. Everything I've just described was known before the DNA. And when they finally read the DNA, the hillside stopped being a burial ground and turned into something else entirely. They sequenced 27 of them, and the first thing that came out of the data wasn't ancestry, it was something much closer to home. 15 of those 27 people were related to each other, not vaguely, directly. They sorted into 5 families: mothers and their children, brothers and sisters, a woman in her early 30s buried with her infant son laid above her in the same grave, and her brother in the ground nearby. And here's the detail that stopped me cold. The families that came out of that soil were mothers, children, and siblings. Every single one. In 5 families, across 27 people, the researchers did not find a single father buried with his child. Now, there are reasons that might be. Men may have been buried in a different part of the ground. Only a third of the cemetery was ever excavated, so there's a lot we simply haven't looked at. But you can't read that finding and not think about the other reason, that fathers at Catoctin were sold or hired out or moved, and that the family unit which survived to be buried together was the one that enslavers found least profitable to break. The families that stayed together in death are the families that were allowed to stay together in life. And notice what else that means. Someone chose where to dig. The relatives are buried beside their relatives, which is not an accident and not a coincidence. It's a decision made at the graveside by people who had almost no power over anything else in their lives. They could not choose where they worked, or who owned them, or whether their children were sold. They could choose to put a mother next to her brother. That's not a scientific finding. That's a family doing the last thing a family can do. If you're finding this as affecting as I do, the fact that a burial map turned out to be a family tree, subscribing genuinely helps this kind of story travel. That's the whole ask. Let's get to the part that made international news. There is a wall in American genealogy, and it has a year on it, 1870. That's the first United States Census in which Black Americans were listed, by name, as people. Before that, in most records, an enslaved person appears as a number in a column, or a line in an estate inventory, or a price. Not a name, not a birthplace, not a mother. So for millions of families, the paper trail simply ends. You can trace your great-grandmother and her mother and her mother and her mother, and then you hit 1870 and the road stops. Not because your ancestors weren't there, because nobody wrote them down. That wall is what this study was built to go through. Here's what they did, and it's simple enough to say in one breath. They took the DNA from the 27 people on the hillside, and they compared it against the DNA of more than 9 million living people who had agreed to have their genetic data used for research. Then they looked for shared segments, long identical stretches of code that 2 people only have if they inherited them from the same person. 41,799 matches came back. Let that sit for a second. 27 unnamed people, 41,799 living relatives from one small cemetery beside one furnace in one Maryland village. And most of those are distant, cousins far enough back that the shared ancestor is somewhere in Africa. But when the researchers narrowed it to the closest connections, the ones sharing long, unmistakable stretches of DNA, they found nearly 3,000 people. And then they mapped where those close relatives live. The single highest concentration was in Maryland. They never left. Think about what that sentence carries. The furnace stopped using enslaved labor in the 1840s. Emancipation came. The furnace itself shut down, and the village turned over, and the story that got told about Catoctin became the story of the European immigrants who took the jobs. The Black history of the place went quiet enough that when local historians started collecting it in the 1970s, they couldn't find anybody who could trace themselves back to the furnace community. But the descendants were right there the whole time, in the same county, driving the same roads. Some of them, statistically, driving over the part of the cemetery that's now underneath the highway. The average gap between one of these people dying and one of their living relatives being born is about 162 years. That is not deep time. That is a photograph in somebody's attic. That's 4 or 5 people holding hands. And the connection isn't only genealogical, it's physical. Some of the people in that ground carried the sickle cell trait, the same genetic variant that turns up in African Americans today. In clinics, in newborn screenings, in ordinary Tuesday afternoon blood tests. The code that was in them is in circulation. It's not a relic. It's running. None of this happens without one person refusing to let it go, and I think she should be named. Elizabeth Comer, an archaeologist who runs the Historical Society in that village, went to the Smithsonian in 2015 and asked them to look again, with better tools and with a completely different question in mind. Not what were these bones, but whose people were these? It took 10 years. The answer was 42,000. Now the part I find harder. Nobody has told them. The people whose DNA came back as matches signed up for research. Their consent form said their data would be anonymous and that individual findings wouldn't be handed back to them. So there are tens of thousands of Americans right now who are carrying a documented, verified genetic link to a specific person in a specific grave in Frederick County, Maryland, and they have no idea, and the people who know can't just call them up. And I understand why that's hard. This isn't fun fact territory. Imagine opening an email that tells you your family history includes a hillside where children were buried without names next to a furnace. Some people would give anything for that information. Some people would not want it that way on a Tuesday with no warning. Getting that right matters more than getting it fast. There's another wrinkle, and it's a quiet heartbreak. Because so many of the people in that cemetery died as children, they never had children of their own. Which means most of the living matches aren't descendants at all. They're collateral kin, nieces, nephews, cousins, many times removed. In other words, those kids have no descendants. What they have is family, still here, 42,000 of them, and the names are still gone. That hasn't changed, and it may never change. We know a handful of first names from wills and ledgers, a man called Collier Sam, 2 men called Henry and Harvey. We know at least 16 people ran. We know that one of them, who left in the autumn of 1802, played the fiddle, because when his enslaver put out a notice offering a reward, the description included that detail. The way you'd describe a missing animal using the thing that made him recognizable. That's the miserable irony of this whole record. The most human details we have about these people survive only because somebody was trying to catch them. We cannot yet put those names onto those graves. The genetics tells us who was whose mother. It doesn't tell us what she was called. And 2/3 of the cemetery has never been excavated. The 35 graves that came up in 1979 were the ones that happened to sit in the path of a road. Everyone else is still there, in the leaf litter, under the trees, unnamed and unstudied and, for now, undisturbed, which I think, on balance, is the right outcome. They've been moved enough. On the last day of February, in 2026, a group of people gathered in a small chapel in Thurmont, Maryland. The chapel is called Harriet Chapel. It was built by a furnace owner in memory of his wife for the use of the ironworkers, and in a county and a century where nearly everything was segregated, that chapel never was. The Historical Society had spent 7 years raising money to buy the cemetery, which had ended up in private hands. They finally bought it in the spring of 2025, and in that chapel, they handed it over to the Maryland Park Service, so it would be protected as public land permanently as part of the state park that already holds the furnace. Sitting in the pews were descendants, not hypothetical descendants, not a statistic in a database, people with faces, in a church, on a Saturday, at the funeral their families never got to attend. That's the whole arc, and I don't think I can improve on it. A hillside nobody marked, a road that went through anyway, boxes in a museum for 40 years, and then a piece of code, read out of a tooth, that reached across 162 years and found tens of thousands of people who were never told they were owed anything. The furnace is cold, the ore pit is full of trees, the highway is still loud, but those 27 people are the best documented enslaved family group ever recovered in this country, and the reason we know that is that their family is still alive to prove it. They were forgotten. They were never erased.